Just going to wait a little bit to let people join the webinar. We'll start shortly. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sraj Desai. I'm one of the champions of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series. Today, we have one of our embedded researchers, Paul O'Hare, who's based at the Manchester Metropolitan University, come and talk to us about his experiences working for the Manchester Climate Change Agency. And then we're also fortunate to have Sean Morris, who's from the Manchester Climate Change Agency, to provide us with a response. I'm going to provide a few program news in the beginning, and then I'll introduce our speakers. And I think many of you will have attended these webinars before, so you'll know that we'll do the presentations first. If you could put your questions in the Q&A box, you can find that hopefully at the bottom of your screen, and you can use the upvote function to vote for your favorite questions. And usually, attendees are muted unless, we have time to enable you to ask the question directly. The audio and the video and the slides that will be shared after the event will go on our YouTube channel. And do use the chat function if you do have some particular problems, and one of our team members will try to attend to that. And yeah, do use the hashtag and the Twitter handle in your social media. So, got a few items of news to share with you. One is we have a new decision support tool that comes from one of our phase 1 projects. We had a project looking at coastal resilience led by the University of Southampton. And with a bit of extra funding, they have developed this decision support tool, which is a website where you can actually look at all the different coastal areas in the UK and look across different across different criteria of resilience, so environmental resilience, social resilience, and you can actually start changing the weights for that to start looking at how does resilience look like in different parts of the coast. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. This is meant to be a tool to inform, for example, coastal zone management, and as I said, was led by the University of Southampton. In another piece of news, one of our projects, Magic, which is led by Liz Sharp at the University of Sheffield, they've launched a new cooperative. So this comes in the back of the work that they've been doing on rainwater harvesting and looking at sustainable drainage systems. So this cooperative is specialized in designing and installing small-scale retrofit SUDs like rain gardens, rainwater storage planters, and rain garden planters. You can see some of them in the picture there. And people have been trained through the project's Workers Educational Association course as well. So you can have a look at the website to find out a little bit more. And if you come to our showcase event in Hull in September, you'll get to see this in action as well. The final bit of news is about the UK shared socioeconomic pathways data. You will have heard about this if you've attended previous webinars. We've covered this extensively, but one of the things that's happened recently is that the Met Office data portal has now got the UK SSPs available in ArcGIS format. So you can look at the data, you can download the data, and you've got the link there at the bottom. And there's even a story map that actually shows you a couple of examples of combining the Ukssp data with climate data. So what you can see on the screen at the moment here is the combination of population in the Ukssp2 world for 2060 combined with summer temperature changes for RCP 8.5. And you can see how this type of analysis enables you, for example, to look at hotspots for example, of risk, where you've got potentially a growing population and also a growing climate hazards. Another example that's provided there in the story map is around, rail infrastructure and summer temperatures. So if you've got very high summer temperatures, the train tracks can buckle. And so again, this is an example of combining projections of rail infrastructure in this Ukssp2 world in 2060 with changes in temperature. So again, you can see how these, this enables an analysis of hotspots where you're combining these two. And there's a lot more you can do in terms of combining Ukssp data with climate data. And I think the Met Office is looking for feedback. So if you do have feedback on the portal and on the Ukssp data there and the climate data, do feed that back to the Met Office. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul. So Paul O'Hare is Senior Lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. He conducts research on the governance of risk, stakeholder engagement and decision-making, and climate change, resilience, and adaptation. So last year, in January last year, he worked as a resilience lead for the Manchester Climate Change Agency, developing policy on the city's adaptation resilience strategy, and that was funded by the embedded researcher scheme of the program, which was really trying to get researchers hosted and embedded in non-academic organizations for a year. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing about your experience, Paul. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over control to you, Paul.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that introduction, Suraj. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you loud and clear. Yeah.
Brilliant. I will just try to share my screen, so please do shout if there are any problems with it. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming along today. Really very pleased to be here to reflect on my time as an embedded researcher with the Manchester Climate Change Agency. And my former colleague from the agency, Sean Morris, is going to be joining us later. I think he's going to take all the tricky questions, and I'll take some of the easier ones. So we're going to set them up in that way because we're nice like that. Just very, very briefly, a few words just about myself. I'm a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. I've been there for rapidly approaching a decade now. As Suraj already mentioned, last year I was an embedded researcher with the Manchester Climate Change Agency. My main role there was to develop resilience and adaptation policy, because there had been a recognition that there had been a significant amount of work conducted by the agency on climate mitigation, but less had been done on adaptation. So my role really was to progress that work in some way and set up a framework around which the work could coalesce in the future. My previous work has been on citizen engagement and community development, and I also spent a couple of years working on security and resilience in the urban environment as well. So I've given my Twitter handle there and my Google Scholar profile for anybody that's interested in finding out a little bit more about some of my academic outputs. But enough about me. Personally, my role, as I mentioned at the agency, was to give resilience and adaptation a bit of a shot in the arm, because there was a recognition that perhaps we hadn't made quite the same amount of progress that we would like to see alongside mitigation. So I was an embedded researcher, and this provided funding, which placed me with the Climate Change Agency, 80% full FTE for 1 year. So that was it was really nice. Actually, it was quite nice to be able to go into an organisation, integrate into an organisation, and to conduct the work from that organisational perspective. Not without its challenges relating to COVID that we might go on to discuss a little bit later, but also challenges, organizational challenges, and also just the challenge of moving from being a jobbing academic at quite a teaching intensive university into a more policy oriented role, which I really enjoyed. I really relished that opportunity, and it's something as well that we've tried to build into the legacy of the project, that I'll be able to continue to do aspects of that work in future years. And again, I'll round up by looking at some of the legacy aspects of the project as well. So, like I say, there was a great recognition that the city had done some work around climate risk and climate vulnerability, but that this wasn't really, it hadn't really cohered into a cohesive policy. There was also a recognition beyond the policy world that although there had been aspects of really good, really innovative practice across Manchester and across Greater Manchester and beyond, that the networks and the forums weren't quite in place that would lend mutual support whenever other organizations or individuals or civil society organizations wanted to progress their own work around climate resilience and climate adaptation. And although this wasn't really built into my original bid, I did, because the opportunity arose, I did then get involved in some of the more direct policy drafting. I conducted, I wrote a 25-page odd long, 25 odd page long report on resilience and adaptation. And Sean, who we'll hear from later, has the very unenviable task of distilling that down into 3 or 4 pages and putting it into a language that will resonate with policymakers across the city. So I think Sean's going to reflect on that process a little bit later as well. Just a very quick note about the Manchester Climate Change Agency and the Manchester Climate Change Partnership. Well, both of them are responsible for overseeing and championing climate change action right across the city. So we conduct a lot of that work on behalf of the city. We're very much an arm's length organisation. The agency itself, I suppose, is in many respects the secretariat to the partnership. The partnership representing a whole host of organisations, from the corporate sector to civil society, arts and culture, right through to the universities as well, to steer and to coordinate action around addressing climate change. And if you follow the link, manchesterclimate.com, you can see a little bit more about just who is involved and how the partnership works. I think it's quite an innovative approach to coordinating climate policy at a city scale. There was a recognition that Manchester isn't the most, I would suggest, the most exposed part of the United Kingdom whenever it comes to climate change. Some of our coastal cities will really will have a much greater grasp on this, and I suppose with sea level rise, that will become really quite significant in future years. But still, Manchester is definitely exposed to weather hazards, which will be exacerbated through climate change. A couple of recent examples are recent flood events that I'll go on to talk about a little bit later. We do suffer quite badly from heat waves that affect the northwest, particularly with the urban heat island effect, and we will also see the implications of wildfires, for example. So in the hills surrounding Manchester, on particularly bad years or particularly bad wildfire events, the smoke will find its way right into the city centre with significant implications for particularly people with pre-existing health conditions. But I can remember being in Manchester a few years ago during one of the wildfire events in the summer of 2018, and it really was actually quite difficult to breathe. So I think Manchester is beginning to wake up to climate change, and we are beginning to recognise some of the recent weather events might actually be may have indeed themselves been caused by climate change, and certainly will be exacerbated in the future. Now, somewhat naively, I thought that various risk assessments will have already been conducted across the city by various organisations, and it became clear quite early on that actually, although that had been done quite discreetly in certain sectors, nobody had really sat down and drawn this together into some kind of reference document. So right at the outset of the embedded researcher placement, myself and the director of the agency decided that would be a useful document to pull together. And I do just want to acknowledge, other cities have done this work before, particularly Climate Ready Clyde, which has done some excellent work around this in the past. So we did draw inspiration from the work of other cities, but all the while we tried to ensure that the work had a very Mancunian flavour to it, so that it spoke to the people who would be most affected by climate change in the city, but also the people who would be able to take decisions and implement change around climate change adaptation and resilience. So no great shocks here. The climate and weather hazards are pretty much the same as we'll see right across, particularly the northern part of the United Kingdom, but we'll see more short medium-term heat waves, longer-term periods of dry weather, summer storms, particularly through convectional rainfall, increased likelihood that there, for example, would be greater intensity in hourly precipitation extremes. That's a big challenge for an urban area such as Manchester, will lead to quite significant pockets of pluvial flooding, I think, in the future. Autumnal winter storms and winter precipitation, such as those that we experienced back in 2015, not so much in Manchester, but certainly to the north of Greater Manchester. And we might still get some cold snaps and line snow, but of course that will become probably less likely in a warming world. One of the roles that I fulfilled in the agency was to look at what was being produced at the UK level and to try to take that and to make it more relevant for Manchester. So looking at some of the work that was conducted, for example, some of the reports last year from the Climate Change Committee, particularly on climate hazards and also on climate resilience and adaptation, and our progress, or perhaps more accurately, our lack of progress on climate resilience and adaptation, and the implications that would have right across the city. So we did pay quite a bit of attention to the work that's already been undertaken, not just within Manchester, but Manchester nested against the Greater Manchester context, to examine, for example, future flood risk. And in particular, we're quite interested, as I mentioned earlier, in surface water, pluvial flooding, flood risk, which I think will become a serious problem in the future. But I think one of our really quite significant blind spots with a lot of our work on climate change is, raises its head whenever we think about heat waves and the likelihood of heat waves in the future. And what we found was that, yes, these maps have been produced at a national scale, and there is a lot of work, and I know people who are watching the seminar today are conducting a lot of work at the city scale on urban heating. I just don't think that those messages are necessarily finding their way through to the right people. I think planners, decision makers, policy makers are only really now beginning to get a grasp of the implications that that a warmer UK in summers of the future will have. And one of the statistics that really sticks out in my mind, and I'm quite keen to use it every chance I get whenever I'm speaking to people across the city, is that the chances of experiencing very hot summers like the one that we had in 2018 have doubled in recent decades, and that will rise to 50% by 2050. So by 2050, we are probably more likely than not going to have heat waves somewhere in the UK. And I think, again, identifying how cities in particular are particularly exposed and have got particular vulnerabilities around that, I think is a really important message to try to get across, and to encourage people to think about the urban heat island profile that will be driven not just through climate change, but also through urbanization and an intensification of the urban environment as well. As part of the embedded researcher scheme, I was really pleased to meet some colleagues, or quite a few colleagues from the Met Office, who were doing really fantastic work around getting the message across about climate change. And we were very pleased in Manchester to contribute to the development of the climate packs that the Met Office have been working quite hard on. So we worked on this for quite some time. We gave feedback on the emergent format and structure of the climate packs, and the really neat exchange that we got from that was we were able to extract, or we will be able to extract, some of the Manchester specific data from the UK climate projections of 2018, which I'm happy to admit I struggled to get my head around. So I think that was a nice little piece of co-production, because it was something that we were struggling with, but something that we were very keen to contribute to, because we were able to say a little bit about some of our responses to climate change across the city. So if there's anybody anybody watching from a city across, or local authority across the UK who's interested in this, I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with the Met Office and see if you can get one of their future climate packs as well. Something that we found quite useful was drafting a one-page summary of our policy response across the city, and we're looking forward to that being published and freely available later this summer, because I think we'll use it quite a bit whenever we're speaking to people across the city, and also engaging with our wider partnership base. So one of the early things that I did, as I say, I sat down and we looked at what the hazards might be, but we also thought about the risk more in the round, thinking about in particular exposure and vulnerability, and we differentiated 6 key areas around which we thought our main risk could be kind of structured or made sense of, and also areas around which policy interventions and practice interventions could take place as well. I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but if you go to the manchesterclimate.com website, you will be able to track down the framework that we've developed for understanding climate risk. And what we say about that document is that it doesn't provide all of the answers. It isn't a full-blown risk assessment for the city, but it does start to organize how we might structure a future risk assessment for the city. And it also begins to raise critical questions that we think cities across the UK need to start asking whenever it comes to assessing just what the implications, mostly it has to be said negative, but also some of the opportunities that might be derived from climate change, in particular the drive for mitigation, adaptation and resilience as well. So, as we know, there is a significant, what's been referred to as adaptation gap. The UN have referred to an adaptation gap. The Committee on Climate Change also referred to an adaptation gap, which is the difference between the action required to make significant progress on creating a more resilient future and the action that's currently being undertaken. And that gap, unfortunately, has been widening in recent years, partly because we know more about the risks and the impacts, but also simply because we're not doing enough in a coherent manner to address them. And I think a really key message that we were able to pick out last year to help us to speak to policymakers is to identify how, without action and adaptation, we also can't meet lots of other government public policy corporate goals. And a lack of action on climate adaptation will also have negative consequences for climate mitigation as well. And the Committee on Climate Change has been really quite clear that adaptation policy right across spatial scales need to step change in ambition and action. And I think adaptation is really important for cities, because adaptation really will only be conducted, will only be delivered whenever we begin to engage at a very local scale. And the urban scale is perhaps absolutely one of the most important, if not the most important, scales for that. We've also started to identify across Manchester how perhaps we're reaching the adaptive capacity of some of the already built defences that we have. So anybody familiar with Manchester might have heard of the Didsbury flood basin, which is essentially a golf course and some recreation ground in the south of the city along the Mersey that can be flooded in order to take some pressure off the river. And in January 2021, and indeed in the year before as well, the flood basin came very close to being overtopped. And I think that this raises lots of questions about how we're really pushing the bounds of our traditional flood defences. The flood basin's been in existence for, perhaps four decades, maybe even a little bit longer, and perhaps we need to revisit some of the defences that we have in order to assess just how they will perform in a warming world, in a world that will have more of these more frequent and more intense weather hazards. Beyond the work on understanding climate risk, we did quite a bit of work, and I suppose this was the crux of my role in the agency was to begin to think about how we might set aims and objectives around climate resilience. And we played around for a little while with various words that we could attach to this idea of resilience, because I think from my academic perspective, reviewing other cities and what they do on resilience, they very often talk about resilience, but they never really pin down, they don't really necessarily define just what resilience is. They don't try to capture what the spirit of resilience might mean for a local area. So we settled on this idea. We come up with various words that could go in here, but we settled on the idea of progressive resilience, which is a theme. This idea of progressiveness is a theme that we thought would resonate with the city council, particularly key players in the city council. A sense that Manchester should be a city of social justice and of innovation. Even not necessarily if we always are that city, that this is something that we can aspire to be. And out of that, then we developed this rather broad vision for progressive resilience. And I think the key part of this definition is the second part, which talks about how we need to align climate resilience with other progressive agendas around health, happiness, and the creation of a more socially just city, but also around sustainable, inclusive, and green growth. And growth is very important to Manchester. Manchester sees itself as a city of enterprise, and no matter where we might stand on that, without saying things like this, the climate policy would struggle. I think would struggle more to gain traction at the city scale amongst city leaders, and I think that's a sentiment that is widely acknowledged across the city. So I think it's really important then to identify how we can align climate policy with other more progressive progressive agendas beyond pursuing climate resilience policy as an important end of itself. How can we, for example, when we're thinking about delivering jobs for jobs for young people and apprenticeships for young people. How can we ensure that they're green jobs, that they're jobs that also help deliver climate adaptation and climate resilience? And how can we try to achieve climate resilience, as somebody once mentioned to me, climate resilience somewhat more stealthily, and being a little bit crafty about how we identify opportunities for climate resilience in lots of the other policies that cities might be interested in. Now, this is a really wordy slide. It's one of those slides I thought maybe I shouldn't put this in, because it goes against everything that we tell students in the university not to put on a slide, which is lots of words. But what we tried to do is identify what resilience might look like. And I suppose this is probably where some of the more academic context comes into the work, because this is where we identify some of those key lessons that are emerging from really quite progressive and transformational adaptation around ensuring, for example, that we work collaboratively in order to develop a more resilient city, that it's science informed, it's spatially informed. We have got comprehensive assessments, for example, of climate risk, and so on. I'm not going to go through them all, but we also talk in here about thinking about future generations, avoiding adverse consequences, maladaptation, which is a theme in the academic literature, but very often gets overlooked, I think, in a lot of policy. And I'm not sure whether this will find its way into the final policy, but it hopefully has infused itself in the approach that we've taken to resilience, just to make sure that we're not just talking about resilience, but we're talking about the right types of resilience, and a resilience that isn't necessarily socially regressive, which I think some aspects of resilience can be. A little bit more accessible were these a series of principles of progressive resilience that we developed as well, and we workshopped these. We took these to key people across the city and got them to comment on them, and for the most part, well, almost universally, I think people thought that these would be quite useful, because they might guide future practice, and at some point in the future they might become they might actually become objectives that will really start to drive action. But at the minute they're a little bit lofty, a little bit difficult, I think, in some respects to disagree with. But the point is that up until this point we didn't have this for the city, so we had to start by developing these frameworks. And again, talks about I think the right things around enhancing leadership, strategic capacity, about identifying exactly what our climate risk might be, right through to some of the more action-oriented principles around ensuring the urban environment is climate resilient, as far as possible embedding and enhancing green and blue infrastructure. And the last one then is about closing the loop somewhat, encouraging research, innovation, reflective practice to support our progress in creating a more resilient Manchester. And I think the next work for us in Manchester is to begin to develop very identifiable and achievable, yet at the same time ambitious actions that organizations can engage with. I think climate disadvantage is a really important, absolutely vital to a lot of this. And people that work in climate resilience and adaptation, we do get a little bit of stick because we're and I've been accused of this, of taking helping to, well, not helping to, but taking our eye off the ball a little bit whenever it comes to mitigation, but also in making sure that we don't privilege the already privileged whenever it comes to climate adaptation. So again, that's something I think Manchester and the Manchester Climate Change Agency is very attuned to, and ensuring that we infuse our climate resilience and our climate adaptation policy with a sense of social justice, and making ourselves much more attuned to challenges around climate poverty and climate disadvantage as well. But that is, again, work that will be continuing over the next couple of years. Myself and Sean, and I am just moving towards some of the conclusions now. Myself and Sean, we made a presentation to some quite influential policymakers in the city council, decision makers in the city council, and we thought that a neat way into that would be to really think about what the impacts of climate change will be for local authorities, but also what the opportunities around local authority action and policy might be around that. And we were quite keen to get these key messages across to organisations that the further we collectively fall short on mitigation, the greater the risk and the scale of the challenge for adaptation, and making sure and trying to ensure local authority, senior people in the local authority, as well as people delivering services, are very aware that climate change will have an impact on those services and on the management of those assets in the future. And I suppose if all else fails, we can also add in a little bit of urban competitiveness in there as well, by identifying some of the cities across the UK who are already moving decisively in this area and are very much positioning themselves with much greater increasing acknowledgement of the implications that climate change will have for urban areas. And I'm also pleased to say this idea of progressive resilience has started slowly to find its way into other policies. So recent update or refresh of the Green and Blue strategy for the city actually picks up on this theme of progressive resilience and talks about how resilience needs to be progressive, needs to speak to across other agendas, needs to fulfill other goals if it's really to gain traction across the city. We developed a short animation as well, and I'll whenever the talk is over, I'll put this into the chat box so people can have a look at that, which talks about our notion of Manchester Climate Ready, MCR, becoming resilient together, which is the badge that we've given to all of the work that we'll be conducting under the guise of climate resilience in the future. So this is the very last slide. So just in terms of the next steps, I'm continue to work with the Climate Change Agency, I'm pleased to say. Really enjoy working with the team there. And Sean in particular is working on the climate framework refresh, which is due later this year, which will have a much greater emphasis on climate resilience and adaptation based on the work that I conducted in the organisation last year. I continue to be a member of the Adaptation Resilience Advisory Group, which I think is a really nice way of getting a legacy out of the embedded researcher scheme and similar embedded researcher schemes as well. In assisting with citywide reporting, so I still contribute to the annual report to the city's carbon disclosure project, which we're doing at the minute, and also some of the scrutiny reports produced by the local authority. I'm also, and this is a job for the summer, also producing case studies of practical adaptation, Manchester-based adaptation, on a new website that we commissioned, and also bringing some of my other broader experience around, for example, work with the UN's Race to Resilience initiative to begin to identify how we might develop metrics, for example, to identify just what our progress might be around achieving greater resilience for the city. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of my of the work that I conducted for the Climate Change Agency. Very interested to hear people's comments, criticisms, or questions. But I think, is it back to Suraj or is it straight over to Sean?
Yes, back to me. Thank you very much, Paul, for that tour of the embedded researcher experience. If you could just let me share my screen, Paul, I'll just, if you just stop that for a second, let me see if I can put that in. Great. So as Paul mentioned, he worked closely with Sean, and so Sean Morris from the Manchester Climate Change Agency is with us and is going to give us a bit of a response from his side. So let me just briefly introduce him. He's policy and strategy lead for the Manchester Climate Change Agency. He's seconded from Manchester City Council, where he's been principal policy officer for 13 years, focused on energy and international policy. And prior to that, he worked as an emergency planning officer for 10 years at Leeds City Council. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Sean. So over to you.
Thank you, Suraj. I'm not getting any slides. I'll just talk for just a few minutes and to respond to what Paul said. I think what's been really helpful having Paul there last year was he sort of gave us some of the nuts and bolts, and now as a policy officer with the deputy director of the ANC, we're now trying to put that into strategy and where we take it forward, really. So Paul mentioned the framework. So what the ANC at the moment is really in depth doing now is a refresh of that strategy, which will include lots of carbon data about where the city is in terms of where it should be. And then it looks at some of the other key objectives that the city wishes to push forward on climate change. That includes adaptation resilience and all the detail that Paul's mentioned. It includes much greater emphasis on health and well-being around climate change. And again, there's a lot of crossover between climate adaptation and that agenda as well. And we're finding that very much in the sort of practical ways. And then also, how do we sort of develop an inclusive, sustainable economy? So much of what Paul's been saying it embeds into all of those areas as well, really. Paul's mentioned the advisory group. We have 4 advisory groups which sort of bring experts together to validate what we're doing, to discuss and comment on what we're doing in terms of the framework and other work as well. And so we find that really helpful for developing our policy as well. The framework will be published in September. So what will also go in with the framework is a short document. So what Paul has done is sort of a 25-page detail. We're trying to put into a sort of 4 or 5-page summary with extra information about green finance as well, and how we're going to unlock some of the money for this really as well. We're also taking that forward with the council. The City Council is absolutely critical to this. So they're doing a review of their climate change action plan. We're talking very much about adaptation resilience. It's got to be a core part of taking that forward, also into the green and blue infrastructure strategy. And the issues around progressive resilience and vulnerabilities and multiple dividends for resilience, all those issues we want to bring into that sort of very practical policy debate really as well. And then we're trying to also do some very practical stuff as well. So Paul's mentioned the Met Office City Pack, but what we're also doing with the Met Office is now looking at heat planning, heat mapping, looking at the vulnerabilities in the city as well. And we've been working with Exeter University on the local climate adaptation tool as well, which will look at the ways you can go down into wards of the city, look at deprivation, look at issues, and then come up with sort of adaptation policies that you should be tailoring to the areas that you work with as well, really. So much of what Paul has done is given us some of the sort of academic background and some of the ways to create good policy. And now what we're now doing is trying to bring that forward into the City Council and then into the Climate Change Partnership to bring in some of the universities, the big businesses, some of the sectors that really matter for emissions mitigation, but also bring it into their lexicon as well, how adaptation resilience is as essential to them as it is for the City Council really as well. The animation website is also going to go out at the same time as the framework as well, so that we'll have is a framework which is a very short, readable sort of 50-page document with then a lot of a user evidence base of which some of the documents that Paul shared will be there as well. And then the website, which we're going to call, which is Manchester Climate Ready, will be the sort of best practice place for trying to sort of help the public, help the businesses, help the City Council sort of focus that as well, really. So that's a sort of very short summary of how the sort of academic elements of what Paul was doing is being brought into the sort of practical policy-driven way of what we're doing in the city to try to then embed this into the City Council's ideas and policies and strategies and the city in general, really. So I'll leave it at that to allow for some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sean, and thanks for the questions that people have already put in. You can hear me, yes. Keep them coming. So I wanted to kickstart myself then, if I may, Paul and Sean. I sort of see some parallels with national adaptation policy in that for example, the vision, I think you called it, the principles, you called it lofty, Paul. So, and one of the criticisms that the Committee on Climate Change, I guess, has had, for example, of national policy is that it's not concrete enough, it's not measurable. So, I mean, I realize that, your journey has started recently, but I'd be interested to hear from both of you about, when do you think some of the principles of progressive resilience, when do you think some of these things could be translated to targets or something that's measurable? I mean, and for example, I mean, the comparison is with mitigation, right? I mean, with mitigation, you can talk about, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, so similarly, do you think you can talk about the reduction of people exposed to flood risk, or the reduction of people exposed to heat waves because of particular actions you take? I mean, how far down that line do you think you will be able to go in the future in terms of being able to have targets and actually measure some of these things?
Yeah, targets, metrics are, it's a really thorny issue, isn't it, for adaptation? I do know that that UN's Race to Resilience are working quite hard on trying to identify how citywide urban targets might be developed. We do have some targets in Manchester, particularly around green space, around tree planting, but there's a perennial debate as to, are those the right targets? Are they ambitious enough? Because I think sometimes targets can actually, and I know this from some of the work I've conducted in flood risk management, sometimes targets and indeed setting standards and so on can actually drive down action. So it's got to be, it's got to be the right, they've got to be the right targets for the right places and the right people and organizations who will be delivering them. How close are we to setting metrics? I think it's a way off. I think what we're going to try to do next is to get action, even without necessarily setting targets, just getting people engaged with this issue. I think that's, and we could perhaps set targets around that, but I think that's probably the next role. So we are thinking about having some workshops for the partnership in Manchester, perhaps later this year, where we get people to think through how they might be able to work toward the principles. And we did slightly. I'll blame myself for this. I did sidestep the issue of targets because I think the principles are easier to get people to buy into, whereas targets then become something that people can criticize, attack, can opt out of. But it's something that we do need to revisit. Sean, I'd be interested to hear what Sean has to say about that.
Yeah, I think Paul's right in terms of getting the principles in and getting the action in. We've been very much so looking at thinking about how do we do metrics as well. I mean, that sort of parallel discussion we've been having in the health and wellbeing sector. We've had to do a deep dive because we're a MAM at SITA in terms of the whole of the equality agenda. We've had to do a deep dive on climate change, and we've been thinking a lot about what are the sort of direct and indirect impacts on health and wellbeing from climate change, and many of them will have crossovers with adaptation resilience. So what we're really bringing to the framework is these are how outlining what the potential metrics could be, what the potential targets will be, and then really once the framework's out in September, we're going to then work with the city, work with the sectors, to how we then could put that into some metrics, how we could put into specific targets, really create a sort of transition sort of plan that develops it into a program really of work really as well. So one of the things the framework is very much going to have loads of data on is carbon emissions and mitigation and all that. But we're very aware that we've then got to then move that in parallel with adaptation resilience. And so I think looking at the framework that will come after that, because that's getting a regular update, that's what we want to see for the framework after that then as well. So in the sort of next couple of years, trying to find some much more detail to give the city things to work to really as well. But I think in this next year, it's really about working with the City Council, the universities, the key players, about getting their action in place, getting the people that should be leading on it, getting them prescribed roles to do that type of work, and then working into sort of GM level as well, Greater Manchester, in terms of their resilience priorities as well, really, and aligning them with that as well, really.
Thank you very much, both. As I say, participants, do put in your questions. It's your chance to ask Paul and Sean. So I'm going to go with a question that Sarah Walpole has put in here and has been upvoted, which I think is a very interesting one as well. Do you think there's any role for a citizen assembly or other public engagement process in deciding the importance of different risks, for example, depending on severity and likelihood? And what priorities for action and spending should be? I mean, we've had a UK, climate assembly, and Devon has had one, and certain cities have had it as well. So I wonder if you could, enlighten us in terms of how much you see that as a good process going forward.
Yeah, Sarah, I think that there's a great potential for that, because there have been, lots of examples of citizen assemblies, but I think a citizens assembly at the Manchester or Greater Manchester scale that specifically focuses not on mitigation, but on adaptation, resilience, and also on climate vulnerabilities and climate risk, I think would be really useful. There has been one quite recently. I wouldn't say it was a full-blown citizens assembly, but there was one quite recently that I contributed to. So Sarah, if you're particularly interested in that, I don't have the details to hand, but if you want to drop me an email, I can let you know about or tell you who organized that. But yes, I think it's really important because it provokes a public dialogue. They're not without their criticisms, their critiques as well, but I think it's something, and an organization that, like the Climate Change Agency, is brilliantly placed, I think, to do work around that. And we've got expertise at the institutions in and around Manchester that can help deliver these things as well. I'm not just saying Manchester Metropolitan University, but the other places as well. We've got some really good people doing some really brilliant, innovative work around this. And to provoke that dialogue, whether it's through a citizens assembly or other forums, I think is really important. And I think we've got, me as an academic, I've got a responsibility to engage with those things as well.
Yeah, just to add on to Paul's, we did a climate change assembly last summer. We had some funding from an EU-funded Zero Carbon Cities project, and so we asked for nominations, volunteers. We then honed that down to about sort of 60 people from across the city, and then did a series of workshops with them. I'd be very happy to share some of that information. Part of it's on the Climate Change Agency website. It was a local group called Envirolution that sort of led on it as well. So we worked very much with a citizen group and academics on developing that as well. And I think I'd agree with Paul that I think it would be great to then do something similar on the adaptation resilience. It had a bit of it was in there really. It was experts spoke to them as well. But it was very much on the mitigation issue. But it was a lot talking about what barriers are there for the public. What do they need help from the city, and what areas can the city drive and needs to drive really as well. And that's led on in those assemblies to lots of community groups being set up afterwards. And some the members of that have sort of become champions really as well. So we're using the repository people involved to therefore become champions in their areas to start to sort of develop with community groups some of this work further as well.
Okay, thank you both. I think there's a question here you can clarify pretty quickly. Is this limited to Manchester City, or does it encompass Greater Manchester, what you've been talking about?
Very Manchester City specific, but nested within the Greater Manchester administrative, political, and beyond environmental, cultural, social context as well. So we pay attention to the Greater Manchester geography.
Okay. You try to fit in a couple more. What type of public policy goals do we risk missing? I'm assuming the question is referring to because of the unavoidable impacts of climate change?
Yeah, so I think that question maybe refers to what I said, that the Committee on Climate Change was at pains to point out last summer in their reports that if we don't take adaptation more seriously, we'll begin to miss other public policy goals. Now, I can't quite remember if they worked out any detailed examples of that, but they did mention, for example, mitigation. So if we're not planting the right trees in the right places, because of the impacts that climate change will have, those trees will not perform their carbon capture. Capture. They'll not be able to mitigate climate change. Other examples, I think it's where do you draw the line? The impacts that climate change, that overheating will have on schools, on hospitals, the implications for trying to create a healthier, a better educated population. If classrooms are too warm, if hospitals are overheating, they'll all have a knock-on impact on all of those other public policy aspirations that the country has. And also, whenever it comes to a city like Manchester, if we don't take resilience and adaptation more seriously, how can we in the future expect to demonstrate that Manchester is an attractive place to invest in? So I think right across the board in terms of that.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to try to fit in these two, actually. So are there pre-prepared risk profiles for UK regions, local authorities, or did you have to compile the Manchester profiles yourselves? I know you worked with the Met Office in the city packs, but I guess maybe, could you elaborate a little bit there on how that was done, Paul?
Yeah, so there are a couple of projects out there that have identified climate profiles for different places. What we went, we were quite lucky because the Met Office are so heavily involved in the program. We were able to develop city packs in conjunction with them, so we were able to. The Met Office very kindly extracted the climate projections outputs for us. So in terms of the climate, anybody really can download that data and have a play about with it. In terms of we move away from hazards and we think about risk in the whole, that was again something that we had to kind of take and run with, and we haven't quite bottomed out that work, but what we have started to think about is the implications that climate change will have for vulnerability across the city. But it's something that other places have started to really make quite a bit of progress on.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to fit in this final question because it's from my co-champion, and it's great that she's been able to join in. So she likes the inclusion of leaving a legacy of climate resilience for future generations in the principles. But do you think there's any kind of conflict with the need to talk about economic growth in order to engage the powers that be? She's asking because the previous webinar we had was actually on the economic case for climate change adaptation, where there was an emphasis, the Treasury listens to growth rather than how people are impacted by climate change. So I'd be interested to hear both your views on that.
Can I go first, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Manchester. The growth agenda has been the dominant agenda for the City Council for pretty much the last 20 years. And so when we did the workshop with senior City Council officers, that was one of the biggest areas of discussion and challenge, really, as well. But I think one of the key things that's happening in the city is that growth is important, but it's got to be inclusive growth. So we're sort of moving into that sort of wider agenda about what does that mean, really. And actually, adaptation resilience can go very closely and fit into that agenda much more comfortably, really, as well. So I think our political leadership has recently changed, and so we're moving into that sort of discussion. But there will be, I'm sure there will be tensions in developing this. And we've got a sort of booming city centre we've had for a decade and continues to boom in its different way. The pandemic hasn't particularly stopped quite a lot of development, but is it always the right sort of development against what is the needs of the city for dealing with climate change is one of the challenges we've got with health, working within the city council in terms of where it's going to take this forward, really. So that's going to be the biggest challenge for us as we go forward in this agenda, and it will be the same for many other towns and cities as well, I'm sure.
And yeah, I think we'll get further if we also engage with the growth agenda, and we need to do it in a way that's because we need to hook on to these broader agendas if we're going to see climate change really gain traction. So the sort of policy initiatives that we're beginning to think about in Manchester is, can we identify how we can direct growth towards the areas that might have the greatest implications of climate change, for instance, and how we can really begin to address the very big challenges of inclusive growth, but at the same time progressing the climate change, climate mitigation, climate adaptation agendas as well. So it's about how we get that policy alignment, because if we went in and said, this is about running down the growth agenda, I think it's safe to say we wouldn't get very far whenever it comes to dealing with key players in the city. We'd be locked out. I think we have to be pragmatic.
Thank you very much, Paul and Sean, for all your insights and sharing your experience. And also thanks for all the participants for the excellent questions. The last question was actually from Kate Locke in our team, not Kate Lonsdale, so apologies for that. I think what it remains for me to do is to advertise our next and final webinar for the summer. So we have Murray Dale from JBA Consulting, who's going to talk to us about one of their projects that has been looking particularly at future UK climate information in the context of adaptation and resilience to a changing climate. So he'll present some of those findings in a couple of weeks' time. But you can register on the usual place on the website. So yeah, thank you very much again, Sean and Paul, and thank you for attending, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.